Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Wagner Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, we will have 2 questions from a listener. We will start out with Julia, who will join me to answer a question from Amanda, and she wants to know, I'm a do-it-yourselfer parent trying to build a college list for my student, and I've heard you talk a lot about being in profile. How can I know if my student is in profile for the colleges they plan on applying to? Then Susan will join me to answer several questions from Chris from Minnesota, and one of his main questions is, why do colleges judge my student through the prism of their high school? And then we have a brand new interview. It's with Rob Franek, who's the editor-in-chief at Princeton Review. It's a 3-parter. And we're looking at the insight you can glean from the 168,000 surveys that Princeton Review does on college campuses about what the culture of a college is actually like and how you can access that data and how you can factor that into your list building. And friends, no college spotlight for this week. It was New Year's when we were preparing and taking a week off of the college spotlights, but they will resume the following Thursday. Friends, I just want to thank all of you who have sent in a SpeakPipe message for episode 500. It's going to be really special, and I feel it's a celebration of all of our community now because we're going to have many voices on that podcast. And I also want to thank you for your creativity. Most of you who sent in messages actually mentioned more than one thing that's helped you, that you want other listeners to pay special attention to. And I've personally been very inspired by all of the messages that have come in. I'm excited for you to hear that on episode 500. The other thing that you guys did, a number of you did, and I never thought of this, or I would have probably mentioned it, is a number of you mentioned very specific interview numbers or very specific episodes. And I thought that was great because it's really user-friendly for another parent to just look up that episode or look up that interview. If you still want to participate, you have until tomorrow. That's if you're hearing it today when it dropped. This episode dropped Thursday, January 9th. Friday, January 10th is the last day for your voice to be heard and for you to be part of our special landmark 500th episode. Just go to speakpipe.com/YCBK. You'll see a big orange button and just click it. And you can leave your name, or you can leave your name and location, or you can just be anonymous. It's whatever's best for you. All right, let's dive in with today's episode.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Julia, our first recording in 2025. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Great way to start off the new year for sure.
Yeah, we're starting out with a great question that came in from Amanda. We're going to play the question. It's rather lengthy, but it's very thought out, and I'm going to have Julia make her comments.
Hi, Mark and team. My name is Amanda. I am a mom of a senior, and she is currently in the process of applying to her regular decision colleges right now. We've been listening to the podcast for, at least a year and a half now. I'd love to thank you first for the podcast. My daughter's going to be a first-gen student, and so I was leading her blind until I found you guys, and you have been such an amazing resource for us. And I've learned so much and been able to give her much better advice than I ever would have given her just on my own, especially with how confusing and so many steps there are to applying to college. I had no idea. So just thank you again. The question I have, we were listening to the last episode and you were talking with someone about if a student was in profile or out of profile. And that really got us thinking. When we made her list, we did a ton of research. We looked at tons of schools we'd never heard of. I mean, I think we looked at something like 70 colleges or universities online, and then we narrowed it down and then did some visits to the local colleges she's applying to. We did one trip out to California to visit some of the schools she was looking at there over last summer. So that was really great advice. That really did make a difference. But when looking at the common data set, we were kind of using that as our guide to see if maybe this seemed like a school that would be a good academic fit for her. But now we're kind of wondering if we did this right. Hearing that colleges recalculate GPA, that's really been an eye-opener for us, because now we're wondering, like, is what we're seeing on the common data set the recalculated GPA? Is it the GPA the students applied with? And if we don't know how a college is doing that recalculation, how can we tell if my student is a good fit GPA wise? As far as like rigor and course load, we know like that's also a little bit subjective and depends on the school you go to and what classes are available to you. And I feel, and she feels, that she's really pushed herself. She's always taken the hardest classes she was able to take at the schools she was attending. But, if she got a lower grade one semester in a given class, now we're wondering, like, are they just looking at the letter grades and not GPA? Maybe they're just like, oh, we want mostly A students or mostly A's and B's. Or, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's just so confusing. So I guess what I'm really asking for, to kind of boil it down, I'm looking for like a quick and dirty way to tell if my student is in profile for a given school. And I know this feels so late to do this because she's getting ready to submit these applications very soon, but I just can't shake this feeling that, maybe I've misled her somewhere. And I want to make sure that she's got schools on her list that she's applying to that she's going to be a good fit for and that are going to be a good fit for her. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and any advice you have on how to tell if your student's in profile or not. Thanks again for the podcast, and keep it up.
All right. Before you comment, I'll say this. When I first heard this question, it kind of hit me between the eyes because I think for those of us who do this, we see enough decisions that we can kind of calibrate what's in profile and out of profile by seeing lots and lots of decisions. But when you put yourself in the mindset of how does somebody actually do it on their own, it's actually not as easy as you may think. Those were my thoughts, but go ahead and take it where you want to go.
100% agree. And like, Amanda, thank you so much for this question, because it's also a good reminder for us too, and this happens every now and then. We need to take a step back and realize, like, oh, we might be kind of throwing around some words and concepts without backing up what would mean, which the average person would not know, right?
Sure.
So,
yes.
First, congrats to your daughter, and congrats on being what sounds like a really phenomenal mom college counselor. I'm a first-gen student, but I really don't think I would have gone to college if it wasn't for my parents supporting me in that. And sounds like you're probably providing even more support than a lot of other students get. So congrats. This was a great question, and I hope the timing of our answer makes you rest well as that you likely are not in any danger here when it comes to how your daughter's GPA is being, quote, recalculated. And this is a good reminder. We should be really careful with our language on the podcast. So not every college does recalculate GPA. So I'll say this. I worked for 2 colleges. I had one where that was my job. I recalculated the GPA, and I have one that I still read for now that we never look at the GPA. Somebody reads it and characterizes the grades. I double check the grades. And between a curricular rating, which, by the way, I think every college looks at, or the vast majority of them do. So that might be GPA in conjunction with the curricular choices. Sounds like you got that nailed, Amanda. So nice job on that. And then I've worked at 2 high schools, one that didn't give a GPA and one that gave a traditional GPA, weighted and an unweighted, right? So this is a great question. You should know that when we say, or when a college says it recalculates a GPA, it is to a standard 4.0 calculation. And that's because all of us high schools are not standardized. So some high schools, they say a GPA. Some high schools don't give A pluses, right? So you can't, an A and an A plus, or an A is the end of the line. And so the GPA scale, an A and an A plus is the same on a GPA scale. Or some high schools, when I was at Emory, my job was to recalculate GPA. And some high schools would include arts credits or gym credits, or would include grades from non-credit courses. Some wouldn't. And some high schools don't even do a 4-point GPA scale. So really, when we say recalculate, it's to just recalibrate for a standard metric of unit that the college uses. It's not out of the 4.0 scale. It's a normal thing. So you can still discern if your child is on profile based on, if you look at the grades, you can just Google GPA calculator. And you can see what an A minus is, what a B plus is, and you can kind of guess, or you could put in, and I would put in just your academic courses. If you're like an AB student, you can kind of guess where your GPA is. So the recalculation won't be wildly different than what you likely think your child is in profile for, because it's not. If you go to a high school that does issue a standard 4.0 scale, even if they have more than 4.0 for weighted, that's pretty much going to be the same exact thing. It's just going to be unweighted at the college, maybe taking out some courses that were not academic cores, for example. And really, if you have a high school, there's a high school out there with a 13-point GPA scale, that is still recalibrated to a 4.0 scale. So it's not that the college has their own kind of gnarly recalculation or their own GPA scale. It's just standardized to a traditional 4.0 and an accepted understanding that, an A is a 3.7 GPA to a 4.1, so you can also just, try to Google a GPA calculator and just do that for yourself if you have a really wonky GPA or grade system at your high school.
Yeah, this is challenging on quite a few levels. Even the rigor thing.
Yeah.
Because I know Amanda mentioned she's taking that into consideration, but it can even be tricky to know for each school what is their expectation in that area. I want to shout out David Graves, who I interviewed for 2 hours, admission director at UGA, for a couple of reasons. One, they produce very quickly a profile of their admitted students. And you can go on and look at it. So it's just out 25th to 75th percentile, 1400 to 1500 SAT, 31 to 34 ACT. And then they say 9 to 14 classes, 25th to 75th percentile. That would be AP, IB dual enrollment. So they're giving you a testing profile, and then they're giving you a rigor profile, and then they have a GPA profile. And if you look at it, it's going to look wonky. It's like 4.21 to 4.34. But then he also runs an excellent admissions blog, and you can go into the admissions blog where they show you how they calculate that GPA. So something like that is kind of very helpful for someone to, you can look at that and you can see if you're in profile or not in profile. Other schools do it as well, but that one I think is just really good, especially with the admissions blog, and it gives the detail. Because if we're talking about all of this stuff, we really are talking about a few components. We're talking about grades, we're talking about rigor, and then we're talking about testing. If there's scores in the file, right? If there's scores in the file, then that is going to be part of the assessment. And even common data set. And I had to look this up to verify it, but I did. If each institution decides how to calculate or standardize their own GPA internally before reporting to CDS. So even, we think of common data set as this common data. Individual schools are still doing their own internal calculation and feeding the common data set how they want to report it.
Yeah.
You can also, it's worth it to go to, and I know this is work, but if you want to be accurate, you got to do this stuff. You can go to each individual school's admissions section, and sometimes they will have information in there on the website on this kind of thing. Some schools do, some schools don't. But for the schools like the UGAs that give you that detail, that is also kind of helpful, because if you look at that and then you couple that with acceptance rate, which once again is complicated here because for UGA it's 42% in-state, 23 out-of-state. Oh, you know who does a great one? South Carolina. Because South Carolina does a totally different profile for in-state, out-of-state.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the best way to do it, is if you can pull up detailed school profile information that has a combination of their GPA range, 25th to 75th percentile, their rigor, that and then you have to see, are they just calculating AP, IB? Are they counting dual enrollment? Or are they putting honors and advanced in there? And then if they have their testing profile. And then you also, to be even more accurate, you do want to look at the percentage of people that report testing too.
Yes.
It can really skew the testing profile.
Yes.
A good example is close to you, Julia, Boston University.
Right.
That reports around a 1,500 SAT average, but less than 40% of people submit. When you look at the submitters, it hovers around that 40% number.
Yes.
So more non-submitters than submitters, it's obviously elevating the testing profile. So that's the most accurate way, is to get individual school information from them and to see if they'll share if they're recalculating, how they recalculate it. Like I said, looking at the rigor and looking at the grades, testing, and the rigor. And if you can't, then for those who do have it, they can become a pretty good benchmark for another school with similar acceptance rates and similar testing profile. And Julie, you know what I mean. Why don't you comment on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, this is another great, I'll say, if you're also a family that might be using scattergrams, whether that's like Naviance or Score, which also tends to include the SAT or ACT score of the applicant, when, at least in my world, a lot of students aren't reporting very high scores unless they're above the middle 50% range. So it's really hard for people to sort of understand what the competition is. But what I always, including scattergrams, at least in Score, and then also one of my favorite in the FISC guide, is that there's often overlaps with a lot of other students might have, if you like this school, a lot of students also applied to this school. And some of those can have a little different selectivity as well, but generally are looking like, if you look up Duke, you run into maybe, UNC, but then the rest tend to be highly selective near Ivy League tier schools, right? So often, while this is not always true, but really important to know, schools with similar selectivity rates likely are drawing from similar profiles of students, right? So the difference between what the Harvard pool is the same pool as the Stanford pool, which has a lot of overlap with this Duke pool, right? So just because maybe a school might be slightly less selective than the other, it is likely their profiles are really similar because there's not enough spots at all of these selective schools to enroll every student that met that profile that applies, right? So also good to know because it's not just a random act here. It's that they're likely drawing from really similar profile students.
And I think that's one of the best ways to do it when people can't find information. So let's take Duke, which to me is in the 7 hardest schools to get in the country.
Yeah.
Now. And so, but Christoph will tell you, well, they publish it 1520 to 1570. So there's their middle 50%. And their average applicant is in the top 2 to 3% of their class.
Yep.
Now, they'll take kids outside of that. Absolutely. Yep. But just know, especially if you're not hooked. If you're not hooked, it's going to be very difficult.
Yes.
It's going to be very difficult. So there's a Duke profile. Not to use all this super highly selective stuff. If you look at this, I'll go back to South Carolina. If you look at the South Carolina in-state ACT range, it's 21 to 29, 25th to 75th percentile. So they're taking 25% of people in-state with under a 21. So I don't want to use all the examples of highly selective. So if you can find some schools that really flesh this stuff out with real detail, and then look for schools that have similar acceptance rates and similar test score ranges, you're probably going to be a good indication. Because I tell that to Julia, so if you agree with this, I tell people, sure, there are schools that manipulate their acceptance rates.
Yes.
We know that. But for the most part, I find the combination of acceptance rates and test score ranges gives a pretty good barometer of the selectivity. It was a little easier in the non-test optional world because now literally, you can have fake high test scores. 30% of people are submitting and you have a 1490,
Right.
But it really does, and most of the time acceptance rate just is pretty good. Like, there are people that manipulate it, but most of the time it really is pretty good.
Exactly. Yeah.
It really is, like the majority of the time. And so if you get someone that gives you one of those detailed profiles, like some of the schools we've mentioned, do that. And just for any school you're looking at, you should Google the name of the school and the school profile, because one of the things that's great about that is you'll get current year. Like even Common Data Set is a year behind. And while normally selectivity doesn't change very much in 1 year, occasionally it does. And so that's why when you can get schools are coming out now with their 2029 class, I'll tell you a good place to go for this is College Kickstart's blog.
Yes. I was just on that 5 minutes ago, actually.
Yeah. So College Kickstart, what they do is they have a blog, and they have, and I know this because the company that I found it, we have a subscription with College Kickstart, and we just had a meeting with them, and they literally have multiple people assigned to data mining.
Yeah.
And they're literally scouring all of the newspapers across the country. And now they're at the point where these colleges notify them as soon as they release. They send it to them right away, they said. So what happens is all the early action stuff and ED stuff, they're out immediately with descriptions of their class. And that is the most current because CDS Common Data Set will run a year behind. And once again, if there's not a big change, it's not that big of a deal. But a few years ago, I remember in 1 year, both Colgate and Auburn both had 100% increase in their applicants.
I know.
In 1 year. That was a bunch of crazy stuff all happening at once.
Yep. Pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. Pandemic, switch to test optional, and in case of, Colgate, they came out with a brand new, financial aid plan that was way more generous. A bunch of things all happened at once. That can throw you off. And that happens, those of us who are in the field, we have to watch that. Case in point, and we were talking about this our regulars know, we, as our team of co-hosts, we have our own very active text feed where we blow each other's phones up all day. And we were talking like, what happened to High Point? Because High Point used to like pretty much accept every ED. Not this year. They shot up 40% in EDs, and their acceptance rate went down significantly. And it's funny, when I was there, they said they were going to do this.
Yep.
It went from 1,600 to about 6,300, pretty much taking almost everybody. And then once they got to the number they wanted to get to, now they're starting to work on selectivity. And I bring them up as an example because this is something that happens to all of us in the profession. We've kind of calibrated what a profile is for a school by seeing so many decisions over the years that we have it kind of mentally in our mind.
Right.
And then when all of a sudden crazy decisions start coming in, it blows all of our circuits.
I know.
So we were going a little crazy in our text chat because kids were not getting in that would have been shoo-ins before. So that's I bring that up only because that's one of the reasons why, if you can get current year, it does safeguard you if it happens to be a school that had a huge spike like that.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Anything we haven't said you want to share on this one, Julia?
No, great question. Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, my only regret, Amanda, I know you sent this in 3 weeks ago, and I know you have a senior, and my fears were getting this to you too late. I'm going to run it like right away, which will be next Thursday. And hopefully some of the schools on your list, either aren't at their deadlines yet, or you have time to take some of this, or maybe have another student you can apply it to.
Well, I will say that I do think Amanda has nothing to worry about, because I am sure that when you were looking at the common data set and the GPA, what they put down is very close to how you interpret GPA for your students. So I think you should be fine.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thank you, Amanda.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Susan, we have a question from Chris from Minnesota. We always love hearing from our Midwest listeners. I'll play it and we'll get your thoughts.
Hi, this is Chris from Minnesota. Thank you for the podcast. It has so much useful information. However, it seems to me that your podcast spends 90 or so % of its time covering admissions for what Pivot podcaster Scott Galloway calls remarkable students. For the purpose of discussion, I would define a remarkable student as kids with an AP-loaded, 3.8 GPA transcript and 32 plus ACT. While our oldest child fit that category, our youngest does not. He falls into the 3 to 3.5 zone, though he does take quite a few AP classes. He's also at a very competitive public high school, which ranked around 120 in the nation last time I looked. In one podcast, I think you referred to this zone as a DOA for admissions readers. I have two questions. One, can you recommend podcast resources focused on kids in that, 3.0 to 3.5 segment? And two, why do schools want to evaluate kids in the context of their specific high school peer group? Doesn't this punish above average kids who just happen to go to a very challenging high school? Thank you so much for your response, and thank you again for all the work you do.
Hey, Chris, great question. I have so many feelings. So many feelings about your question and kind of the subtext of the question. First of all, is my personal approach to this after a fairly long career, both on the secondary side and in college admissions, is that this whole process focuses too much on a small sliver of students in the applicant pools of most of the schools in this country. And your second child actually sounds like what we used to call bread and butter, which are great kids with strong credentials, a lot of growth potential. The myth of perfection is a really bad thing. And reading applications for, a very selective university now, it's very hard for kids who are super duper high achievers to distinguish themselves. And what happens is a lot of them don't get into highly selective colleges because there are good grades and maybe good scores and good stuff, but they are often indistinguishable. They often group around the same majors, and there's often a kind of a low level of originality in that pool. And I'm not saying this to disparage high achieving kids who've worked very hard for those accolades, but in my humble opinion, the kids who have a huge advantage in the admission process right now are the kids in the middle. And when I say the middle, I don't think your second son is in the middle. I think he's very high end. And I think he is probably a very remarkable young man. You just can't put him on a yardstick with, on the basis of a GPA or the number of APs or whatever. And you got to kind of look at it like the colleges look at it, which is, searching for, smart kids with a lot of potential who are going to add not just to the classroom environment at the college level, but to the campus community and do wonderful things in terms of their own growth, but also for their classmates and for the atmosphere on campus. So that's my soapbox a little bit there, that, you have to understand too, that my personal perspective here is that every child is remarkable, and whether they have struggled to get passing grades in high school, or whether schools come easy for them, they are all gifted, and they are all remarkable. So, this is my mantra in the profession, and Mark knows me well to know that I've carried that through my work. So that said, why? Your question is, why compare students within the same school? Actually, that's not what you said. You said compare them within their peer group. I just rephrased that to say within the same school, because there's a big, big, big distinction there between how you phrased it and how I'm rephrasing it. So when I have read applications over the years, it is important to understand the school from a student attends, right? Because I might be reading students from very low resourced high schools where no students, even if there is an advanced curriculum, of any kind, advanced courses, AP, IB, whatever that is, even if there are those courses, very few kids take them, and they are poorly prepared for those assessments. And there are a lot of high schools in this country that don't even offer calculus or physics or things like that. So that's an extreme. But then there are schools that are very well resourced, and it's important for a college to understand what's been available to a student. Not that there's an expectation that they should all have taken the same path, right? Because they're differently gifted, and in terms of their talent, their ability, but also their interests. So you're not expecting that as a reader, as an application reader. But what you're expecting is that a student has kind of moved through high school in a way that has played to their interests, but also has pushed them, challenged them to stretch their boundaries a little bit and not take the easy path. I met with a student in the counseling room the other day who isn't taking, this is just an example, who isn't taking math in his senior year. And I asked him why. I don't run into that very often, truthfully, with kids who are college prep. And he said, well, I don't like it. I haven't done well and I don't like it. And I said, well, that would be okay if you were applying for Bachelor of Fine Arts programs. But you're not. You're actually applying for liberal arts and some pre-engineering-ish kinds of programs. I said, we have to talk about that because you voted with your feet in high school. You kind of made a choice to avoid rather than embrace. And there could be all sorts of good reasons for that, but it's something that you have to accept responsibility for at this juncture. If I'd been talking to you a year or two earlier than the fall of your senior year, we would have a different conversation. So colleges do care what kids are doing in their high schools. But Chris, please believe me when I say they're not expecting every student to have taken a dozen APs and be at a 5th level of math, science, foreign language, social studies, and whatever. So I know I'm kind of responding on a couple of different levels here, but your son won't be necessarily compared to other kids in his high school, but he will be looked at relative to what his high school has had to offer him. So the big thing here is, has he made appropriate choices? Not every kid can go into honors math in 9th and 10th grade. That set them up for a high level, a calculus class senior year. Not every student has access to summer school classes that allow them to accelerate. Some kids have to work. Some kids, don't live near or have access to accelerated work that helps them move ahead. So know that context is everything. Your son attends a great school, perhaps. He's done well. He doesn't look very average to me from what you said. He actually looks pretty strong. And it's kids like this young man who actually will have more options if he applies wisely. So maybe he's not going to be applying to the Ivy Plus group because he doesn't have a lot of the bells and whistles that might keep a student in the running for the group of colleges that admit below 10% or below 15% of their applicants. But you know what? There are so many colleges in this country that are so hungry for kids who have, B plus averages. They're taking college prep courses. They score well. They're engaged. They're serving their school and their community. They are viewed as positive collaborators and contributors in their school and in their life outside of school. Those are great applicants. And there are hundreds of colleges that would be not just hungry to admit that student, but even give them merit scholarship money. So remarkable, absolutely. And I know your bar is high because it sounds like you've got an older child who's a rock star. But just remember the bigger pool, and that this remarkable second child that you have, who's remarkable in his own ways, is probably going to have even more options than your older son if he applies intelligently.
Thank you for that, Susan. Everything you said was so apropos and spot on. I want to take it from a slightly different angle. My understanding was, one thing Chris was asking was the question that I asked to Andy Strickler. We have on from time to time, and he has the New York City schools, and he has the New England boarding schools in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And that is it harder to get into a selective school from what some people call a busy school group that generates a lot of applicants? And you can go back and listen to Andy's answer, but in essence, he said there's absolutely something to that. And I understood Chris to be saying, why is that true? Why should you get, quote unquote, punished for going to a really good school? Although he didn't use that word, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but why should the bar be higher? And so I want to talk about that a little bit. And I think a lot of people have that question.
No, I hear you. I think we saw it the same way.
Oh, okay.
Mark, but I didn't entirely agree with Andy's dissection of that, but I was really, really interested in it because of the yield issue. So, Metro New York and all the, prep schools in Southern New England were my territory for a long time for a selective liberal arts college. And my responsibility was to yield kids from those schools. Right?
Yeah.
And so I not only had to do a careful evaluation, but my job was not to line them up by academic rating, but to figure out who we could potentially yield. So
it's such an important point.
Yeah. And
it's such an important point.
A busy school group, a big school group. I mean, I used to read Bronx Science and Hunter High School and, Dalton and Collegiate and all of those, is I had to figure out who was a strong applicant, but also was a great fit and wasn't possibly just using the college as a 10th on a list of 10 or 20.
And that's one of the major factors. In fact, just this week, I was talking to a student from, one of the sort of shishi, hoity-toity New York City schools, and, the dad was asking me a question, and I said, you need to trust your school counselor, because the dad said to me, and I'm not going to mention the school, but it's one of the ones everybody knows. And he said, if you apply from our school to Northwestern in regular, you have a chance, but not at Emory.
Interesting.
Now, overall, Northwestern is more selective than Emory. Like, they're both very selective. It's incremental, but overall, Northwestern is a little more selective than Emory. I feel I have enough data to say that. But that is very specific knowledge. And I told that family, you need to listen to your school counselor, because they have knowledge of yield. They have knowledge of conversations that they may have. And so this yield piece is important. It can be one of the reasons. It absolutely can be one of the reasons. It can be a major reason. Also, you've heard me say this over and over again, colleges want what they don't have. And you want to have diversity within your schools. And from some of those busy school groups, you are going to end up having lots of kids, and they want voices from other places that they're not getting. And then there's another component that I would add, which is, and I think this is I hope I can articulate this well, but a lot of times if someone is coming from an upper middle class background, social class is just the air you breathe, the water you drink, and you don't think you're not even sort of aware of certain things that are class privilege. Susan Hillary stirred up some controversy in our roundtable when we were talking about people prepping, and she said the fact that somebody even has time to put all that into prep tells me something. A lot of people reached out to that about that. They thought that was unfair because that just felt so normal to them. Of course you would have time for prep, but
you mean for test prep?
Yes. And admission officers see much more of a range of the full socioeconomic spectrum.
Right.
They read applications from kids that, that their internet goes out or their family can't afford, to buy books, so they go to the library. And I mean, they see a range of different things. When it was really hit home for me was when I was talking with Jess Lord about this at Haverford. And he said, reading those QuestBridge applications, it trains our admission staff so well. He said the next time when someone puts in the additional information section that they, their grades were bad because they had mono, that is nothing compared to, living out of a car.
Right.
And not to say that it shouldn't be listed. We're not saying that, but the point is, admission officers have such a sense of the breadth of the wide range of different social classes, and they value something Rod Skinner came on here and talked about, which is distance traveled.
I love that. Distance
traveled. How far have you gone with the resources that you're given? I'll always remember this, Susan. The first college fair that you and I did together in 2005, we had Cliff Thornton as our keynote speaker. Somebody from Germantown Friends, which is one of the prominent schools in Pennsylvania, stood up we had a big forum in our theater in addition to the fair. And the person stood up and said, my kid would be 4.0 if they went to the school around the corner, but they're not 4.0 because they're at Germantown Friends. Are you going to factor that in? And Cliff, because he's never, he's never shy to speak his mind. And he said, to whom much is given, much is required. And I'm not arguing that it's harder to get an A at Germantown Friends than the school around the corner, but your kid also has access to resources. And we also have to factor that in. And sometimes families don't fully realize what those resources are in the way that an admission office does, that really does read in very under-resourced pools where, the counselor letters are just completely different. The extracurricular offerings are so different. The teacher recs, I mean, there's just every single component of the process. You see that you're dealing with someone who's less resourced, and they factor that in. And so those are some of the other reasons I would add that when you're coming from an area that might have more than average wealth and a college going culture throughout the whole school and resources, that a college will factor that in as one of the factors they take into consideration when they read your application. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. You may have noticed, Mark, that the Common Application starting last year has a section of questions that are being used experimentally right now by about 50 colleges. Have you noticed that?
No, I've been following the direct admit, everybody getting tagged on
Yeah.
that, but no, I haven't followed this.
I've
Tell
been
me about
seeing,
it.
as I do right now at this time of year, I'm doing kind of what I call a holistic Common App review for the students I'm working with who have November 1st deadlines, where I put on my admissions hat and I look at the PDF of the Common App and the supplement of that school. And I look at it as if holistically, as if I'm reading the application from a college perspective, which is hard because once you know a student, you lose the fresh impact of it. But so I look at the whole thing. And what I'm noticing as I go through Common Apps is that some students are being asked to respond to this optional questionnaire, which is basically about responsibilities. I would call it responsibilities. Like, what are you responsible for? And it's home, community, personally. And what Common App has found is that even though they've changed the description of what counts as an activity, kids still are not reporting work and family responsibilities in the way that they probably should be. So a bunch of colleges stepped up and apparently are using this experimentally for a couple of years. But that just made me think of it with what you were just saying. I think, in conclusion with Chris, I think what his second son should do is not get carried away by applying to the schools on the basis of their ranking or selectivity, because we know that selectivity has almost nothing to do with quality of fit and undergraduate fit. And he should focus on schools that are going to bring out his best. Boys develop not more slowly. They develop appropriately for young men, right? They don't look as together and perfect and spit polished as girls. We see this in the applicant pool. It's almost funny, but having boy-girl twins myself, I can speak from personal experience, that the girls can almost look like they have peaked in high school, which is not good, actually. The myth of perfection and, looking like you've peaked in high school is not good. Colleges are all about growth potential and how is a college going to take you to the next level. Boys never look very perfect. They always look like they've grown in fits and starts and that their cognitive development has lagged behind whoever else, So when we read applications now for the university that I read for, we're not comparing boys and girls. Kids are never compared to each other. They are evaluated and ratings are assigned individually based on the context that they're coming from. But even when a school group might be reviewed, as Andy was referring to, where it's a very busy school group, and you might have 30, 40, or 150 kids applying from the same high school, that there are different ways that colleges look for students who are a great fit and who are are likely to keep growing and contributing, but it's not linear by GPA, right? I really believe that.
It's really important. And it's also important to know that colleges have the ability to look at somebody who may be in that school group that isn't coming from as well a resourced family
Absolutely.
and factor that in, and rather than take one broad stroke of the brush and apply it to everybody.
That's right. And kids
tools.
are applying for expressing interest in different academic areas. They have different potential personal contributions. And the important thing for Chris to remember is that colleges that are assessing demonstrated interest are looking for this, especially at kids who are in the middle of that applicant pool for them. So a student who is maybe not the top achiever in a school group, but who has been engaged consistently over time and done all the extras in their application is going to get bumped up in the ratings substantially, especially if one of the ratings reflects likelihood of enrollment. And we know now that if a college considers demonstrated interest, and on the common data set that's titled Level of Applicants' Interest in section C7, you can't miss it, bottom of the chart. Every college is letting families know where they're at on that, right? Almost every college publishes that there is going to be some kind of score in that application that is acknowledged at some point in the evaluation process. It may be not at the first level of reading, it may be the second level, or vice versa. But colleges that are assigning an affinity score, which is what some schools call it.
A lot of schools use that term.
Yep, I heard that at NACAC.
Well, both of our co-hosts, both Connecticut College and Colorado College, you'll hear them use the term affinity score.
That's right.
Connecticut and Colorado College.
And it goes for big universities as well.
Exactly.
And in fact, I don't think a family could say, well, at a giant university, they're not going to notice. Actually, it can be even more influential because they go more by analytics. They go more by metrics. So, a student who may feel a little bit like he's reaching for a college based on who else in his school might be applying has all sorts of opportunities to really shine and attract positive attention to his application.
Friends, as I was editing this episode, I felt like many of my comments about well-resourced schools were good, but all of the examples that I used made it seem like the bar was going to be harder if you were coming from a well-resourced school. But there are other things that often happen behind the scenes that will not be mentioned at any info session that strongly favor and advantage well-resourced schools. The biggest factor in admissions that I feel the public would be surprised about if they really knew how often it impacts admissions decisions is money. Most well-resourced schools are going to get a lot more college admission officer visits, partly because people need to fish out of a pond that is full of full pay and high pay families. And that means you're going to need to go to schools where a lot of the families are going to make over $200,000. And we know those are the well-resourced schools, private and suburban publics. Secondly, a lot of schools have it as an institutional priority to increase the graduation rate of their students. And one well-known way to increase your graduation rate for your students is to fish from a pond where there are a lot of families where both families graduated from college. These students, and I count myself amongst that group, by the way, they come from a college-going culture where going to a 4-year college and graduating is not only the norm, but any other option really, quite honestly, is unfathomable. So these factors often give the student from the well-resourced school a level of access to admission officers that their moderately resourced or under-resourced local school just doesn't get. It's also quite common, especially in upper middle, the middle, and the lower part of the food chain, for this to be a really significant priority when it comes to targeting these well-resourced schools. And friends, there's a third reason that gives a huge advantage to well-resourced schools, and that is no matter sort of where a college is in the proverbial food chain, there's always going to be pressure to get more applications. So let's say you're all the way to one extreme and your school literally is in danger of possibly closing or merging or massively downsizing or huge layoffs. How do you stem that tide? Well, you get more applications, right? You got to have applications in order to get enrollees, in order to get heads and beds. Or maybe you're a school that there's no question you're going to be full, but you're still trying to upgrade the quality of your school. You're trying to round out your student body in ways that maybe you haven't done in previous years. Or you could be in, I don't care, the most selective schools in the country. There's still going to be pressure because there nobody is impressed that you're full. They're going to look at, are you ceding ground to your competitors? And the people that judge you are going to judge you by a very high standard. So either way, you need a lot of applications. And how do you get applications? Well, you go to places that consistently deliver a lot of applications. And what are the places that consistently deliver a lot of applications? It's going to be well-resourced suburban public schools and independent schools because it's a college-going culture. And so when you're making up your travel plan, you're trying to decide where to travel, you're not going to ignore your traditional feeders. So all that is another advantage that it gives the well-resourced schools and giving them access. And that access can lead to a lot of things. It can lead to interactions that you may have with an admission officer. Perhaps they do interviews at your school and form or bond a relationship with them. Or maybe there's a fair. And I'm not saying just because you go to a fair that increases your chances, but certain instances, some people do stand out and are memorable just depending on, circumstances. I don't want to imply that that's the norm because it's not. But another advantage is the more a college visits your school, the more they know the school. And they know the counselors, and they know the gradings, and they know the unique extracurriculars, and then they can properly evaluate you in context. Whereas another school that they don't visit that often, there's a certain aspect, well, can I trust this school? We don't have a track record of a lot of applicants coming. I don't know it very well. So it introduces a risk factor. So this is another factor that gives the well-resourced school an advantage over the under-resourced or the moderately resourced high school. So I just wanted to add that to provide some balance to my previous comments. Susan, I want to comment on, thank you for that, by the way, that was awesome. I want to comment on the first part of Chris's question because it's important. He started by saying, it seems as if your podcast is designed for remarkable, and he quoted Scott Galloway, what he calls remarkable students. He defined as 3.8 and above. One, could you recommend a podcast for us that focuses on non-remarkable students? So the first thing I want to say is that is not how I see our podcast. I see our podcast as trying to meet the needs of our listenership. And so I would say to the extent to which there are more students out there that are not just where Scott's son is, that 3.3, 3.4, 3.5, but 2.5, 2.3, 2.8, 3.0, please send your questions in.
Right.
We don't value questions anymore from a family of a super high achiever to someone who the family's not even sure if they're going to make it to the graduation line. We do try to be responsive to our listeners. I'm personally not aware of any podcast that focuses on that. Maybe on like a 3.0 student exclusively, or that's their whole focus. And maybe our listeners, if you know of one, you send that in. I'd be happy to come out. There's so many of the podcasts now. It's hard. I can't keep track of them. When we first launched, there weren't that many. Now everybody's got a podcast. But I will say this. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I guess I was when we did our survey in 2022 of our listeners. It did reveal that a lot of our listeners do have students that are doing well in school. In fact, I literally have our survey results right here. So we asked this question to our listeners. Which of the following grades of your oldest child in the 5 courses, math, English, science, social science, and foreign language, best describe you? We want to target some of our topics to the performance of the majority of our listeners. So this was the result of our survey. 45.6% said straight A's. 40.4% said A's and B's. 3.7% said B student, and 2.2% said B's and C's, C's and B's. So I do feel like we have an overall audience that is not necessarily reflective of the average student. And I've had a chance to think about that, and it kind of makes sense, because who's going to take 2 to 3 hours a week and listen to a podcast like this? It's a certain kind of parent, and it's a parent that is very much invested in college for their student, and that same parent tends to do a number of other things. They tend to do their best to make sure their student is in a very good high school, public and private. They tend to do a lot of enrichment, like summer programs and things like that. They tend to be somebody who would have their student do test prep and travel. And our audience is just a little bit more that way overall. 58.8% of our listeners have a master's degree, and 1 in 5 have a doctorate. So some of what he may be picking up is the fact that our listenership is not necessarily reflective of the average family, that makes about 73,000. We have those listeners, and we get excited. We get excited when they write in and say, thank you for helping my student. I could never afford to hire an independent educational counselor, and your podcast was our counselor. Those are some of the most rewarding messages we ever get. Or to the person that's running a CBO, and they're helping students who are under-resourced and underserved, and those things elate us. But I just want to say, we do not see ourselves as the podcast for the 3-8 kid and above. We're just trying to be responsive to the questions that come in, and we would love more questions that came in from 2.0, 2.5, 2.8, wherever you are on quote unquote the GPA spectrum. And I appreciate Susan saying you're more than a GPA. You're a lot more than a GPA, and you're all remarkable. So I just wanted to to answer that. And if we have a blind spot and we're doing more of that than we need to, I appreciate you calling us on that. But I can tell you that's just not how we see ourselves. We just see ourselves as trying to field and answer the questions that you all as listeners send in to us. Anything else, Susan? Or
no, I think my only comment, Mark, is that when you bring on college admissions professionals to interview them, you've always represented a really wide range of selectivity. And I have learned so much from you and the interviews of colleges that don't naturally surface in that, highly competitive cohort. And I've added so many more colleges to my list that I recommend to families based on these interviews that you've done with these folks. And I just really appreciate the fact that you don't focus those interviews on, the elite institutions that are, highly rejective.
Well, we're trying. Like, one of the things we're trying to do with our college spotlights is to shout out schools that fly under the radar.
Right.
So, right now, Linda and Lisa are just finished up one on Furman.
Oh, great.
Which admits more students than it denies. And then the one that will likely be airing at the time this goes live, or it may have just aired, they've got one they did on Colorado State and Fort Collins. And then literally right now, Susan, as you and I are recording this, Linda and Lisa are recording one on DePauw in Indiana.
Awesome.
So we are trying our best to shout out some of these unheralded schools that people don't always know about, the Beloits and others of the world, while at the same time we do get a lot of requests for the Dartmouths and the Georgetowns, and so it's a balance, and Absolutely. I'm not saying we strike it perfectly, but I will say that it's important, as part of what we see as our mission, is to introduce people to schools that are not just quote unquote the T20s. We do not see this as the podcast where you turn in and learn how to go to Harvard.
Right.
There are plenty of those out there. We're trying to do something a little broader here. And the best thing that I could say to listeners is if you're feeling like we're not covering where your student is, please go to speakpipe.com and ask your question about your student, and we will be sure to make sure we air it. But I really appreciated Chris's question, and I appreciate you could see the spirit of it, and you can tell the
Absolutely.
spirit is well intentioned, and I appreciate it, and I always appreciate all feedback. So thanks as always, Susan.
You bet. Thank you, Chris.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, this interview was a lot of fun for me, and I'm talking about my interview with Rob Franek, the editor-in-chief of the Princeton Review. In part one, Rob shares his backstory. Then Rob shares how his work at Wagner College informs his work today. Rob talks about the survey called College Hopes and Worries. The Princeton Review has done for 20 consecutive years and reveals what the survey results have recently revealed. Then Rob shares what students can learn from the Princeton Review's annual surveys, and he shares the number of students who participated in their survey this year. Rob explains how the rankings the Princeton Review produces is categorically different from other college rankings. Rob explains how many students complete surveys at each of the respective campuses where they do surveys. And then Rob explains the process of how they go about collecting surveys every year. Listen and enjoy. Friends, I'm here with Rob Franek, the editor-in-chief of the Princeton Review. Hey, Rob, welcome to your College Bound Kid podcast.
It's good to see you, Parker. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I love the work you guys do, and I think it's misunderstood and with a lot of the other noise out there. So we'll get more into unpacking why you're here today and what I want you to talk about. But we always like our listeners to give their backstory so people know the context from which you'll speak.
Sure. Well, I'm editor-in-chief of the Princeton Review. Delight to be here today, and it was good to see you at NACAC a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. That was my 23rd or 24th NACAC. So I've been in higher ed for almost 30 years. I went to a little school in New Jersey called Drew University, which was a great school for me. And then I was a small school, 1,800 kids. And then I got a job right as I was graduating Drew, and I worked at a little college in New York City on Staten Island called Wagner College. And I was assistant director of admission. And I get a little crash course on the school. They gave me a car. And then my territory was all of New York City, all through Maine. So I was on the road for like 6 years, and it was awesome. And then I used to teach for Princeton Review when I was an undergrad at Drew. And there was an article in the then still paper edition of the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And they said they were looking for somebody that had 5 to 6 years college admissions experience. I'm like, I'm just starting my 6th year. And then the second thing was you had to have a sense of humor. I'm like, I love these guys. And turns out I applied for this job, and my old roommate from Drew shared an office with John Katzman, who was the owner of the creator of the Princeton Review. Sure. And he says, you know this guy, Rob Franek? And my friend Reed said, you're stupid if you don't hire him. And then 25 years later, Mark, I'm still sitting here. So it's been a good gig.
Well, he's been coming up quite a bit lately. We've just had Jay Rosner on recently. I know you. Oh, I know you and Jay go back as well. I know, which is awesome.
We do, my dear friend in college, Jay. Yeah, just great egg.
Awesome. So, how did your work at Wagner still influence you today? I'm a believer that once you've done admissions, it kind of shapes how you think, and I would think it still informs a lot of things you do today. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, 1,000%. And I'm so glad that you brought that. I brought that up because, when I was first presented with this opportunity to work at the Princeton Review, I loved working in college admission because I like working with students. I like working with their families. And I just assumed, Mark, that meant that you had to work at a particular school, and you might move school to school, but it felt like a tectonic change to move from one, little school in New York City to this international brand that, I took when I was in college and just thinking about this company. But the truth was that my roots in college admission and loving working with, I call it the Holy Trinity, college-bound students, their parents, and counselors helping them along the way. I was able to do that representing a school, but now I'm able to do that across schools, across the states, internationally as well. And the thing is, students are nervous about the college process in many regards. And as their parents are, they're nervous about money. They're nervous about return on their investment. They're nervous about picking the right major or picking the right school. And many of those things are common to all of us. And we were all in that sort of uncertain period in our lives. Can we, and this is the blessing of being at my perch at Princeton Review, can you give this, can you relieve some of that stress and create a confident college shopper, students, parents, and counselors? And that's the work that I've been doing for a long time here, 25 years.
No, that's awesome. And I know there's a lot of topics you can address. Any of our listeners, just put Rob's name in YouTube, and I don't know how many videos you're up there, but it's maybe 100 plus. You're all over the place, and you do a lot of back to school nights and things. So you're pretty multifaceted at the topics you can address, and we're going to stay fairly focused today. But there's one thing I want to ask you about that's not on our topics today that I find fascinating. Talk about the survey that Princeton Review does on college hopes and worries that you've been doing for like 20 years. What are some of the top worries that students and parents are surfacing in that survey that you do? And is there any way students and parents can access that survey?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's accessible. It's called College Hopes and Worries, and you can get the full report on princetonreview.com. You just put in College Hopes and Worries, and it'll come right up. It'll be the full report as well as just the truncated data set if you just want to get the highlights. But it is one of my favorite topics because I as you said, I do a lot of speaking in high schools and college campuses. I did 107 live events last
Wow.
year, which I will dwarf Mark this year because I got it loaded up through almost to the Christmas holiday. So it's anyway, it's all good. But college hopes and worries. So the idea of talking to and surveying college-bound students and their families, right, and talking about their hopes in the college process, but then when you and I have been doing this a long time, it's a relatively easy conversation if you know where students' hopes are and their parents' hopes are. But if you can understand where they're worried, where they're stressed, where they're nervous. I've been a teacher for a long time, and I can smell fear from my students at 5 blocks away, right? And the truth is that students that are motivated by fear or parents that are nervous and have some fear and anxiety around college admission, then they make mistakes that if they felt confident, they probably wouldn't make. But we're human and we all have anxiety and some fears. But so if I can understand where those worries and those fears are, and then we can create conversation and resources and just direct to students and parents saying, hey, I see you and I hear you. I understand what you're stressed about. And let's bring this up. Let it not be a taboo. Let's not kick it down the virtual road here, and let's talk about it now. Biggest things that are our biggest fears. It's 9 years consecutively running. Biggest fear for students and parents is assuming too much debt to pay for college. A very close second is that they're going to get it. Students are going to get it in their first choice schools, but families aren't going to be able to pay for it. So it's that giant umbrella of fear and stress around cost and debt and navigating expertly the financial aid process, particularly given the last, now year and a half, we're all waiting with bated breath for, December 1st to roll around with the new FAFSA form, hopefully coming out. So that's one of the biggest ones.
You've been doing the survey 20 years. Has that always been number one or two, or have you seen, some movement if you look back in trends and see what the fears were in the past?
Yeah, and I appreciate the question. It over the last 9 years, it has been eerily the same. Biggest fears around debt. 2009-ish through 15-ish, it was students would get in their first choice schools, but families wouldn't be able to pay for it. So still kind of in that category.
Sure.
The pre-2000, and I'm going to call it 2006, 2007, right before, our difficult financial times in the mid-aughts, 2007, 2008, 2009. But pre that, students were just worried about getting into their first choice school, at least from the subset of students that we had heard.
Sure.
And times have certainly changed. I mean, sorry,
no, it's all good. One of our co-hosts who's been on our pre-vapsa for a while is in Chicago. So our listeners are used to these city sounds. Just so you know, listeners, Rob's in New York City, so you're gonna get some New York City sounds.
Oh gosh, okay. Yeah. But I think that there are so many things that have changed again, tectonically around college admission and the idea of cost. And you and I know this, right? College costs have continued to rise 2 to 3 times past the rate of inflation every year for at least the last 25 consecutively. And that's more than I'm going to talk tomorrow night. This will be part of the agenda. That is more than any parent can expect to earn annually increases in their own paychecks for their work, right? But it is incredibly consistent from a rising price of college. And I'm not saying that that's not warranted. I mean, colleges are huge endeavors, from physical plant to maintaining an academic community. These are expensive ventures, but it's also expensive to from a student perspective.
Yeah, and it's tough because you got less state appropriations, sometimes less federal appropriations, and then you've got the demands of what people expect for college are so different than they used to be when it comes to everything from the student center to the caliber of the food to the success of the athletic team to career support, study abroad, all learning by doing opportunities, experiential learning, all of the different types of things, not just career services, but academic supports. Like it kind of goes on and on and on, top-notch dorms. So it's kind of hard. I talk about that. You can't have the Four Seasons at the Motel 6 price, but at some point, there's not money to pay for it. Everything. Yeah, we're in a precarious situation.
Totally hear you. And you're right to bring it up in the way that you granularly know those things. These are expensive. Any one of those resources is expensive. Pork belly them all together, and it has a hefty sticker price, no doubt.
Yeah. So there's so many things that we could address, but I really want you to focus on our topic of the day, which is what we can learn from the Princeton Review student surveys. So, Rob, I know, I'm holding your book right in my hand, Best 390 Colleges.
Yeah.
I appreciate, because you give me a copy every year at NACAC, so I always get the most recent version when stopping by your booth. It's great. I so appreciate it, and I go through it, and I love it. But, people hear about the rankings all the time. What can people learn from these Princeton Review student surveys?
Yeah. Well, you hit it right on the head, and I'm so grateful for you. I'm going to skip therapy now. I'm feeling so good that you like this book.
I do love it. I love it. Very serious.
That's awesome. But I've been doing this for a long time. Annually for me, 25 years working on this book, and I work with a fabulous team of writers. But the book has been around 30 plus years at Princeton Review. But the process of creating it has not changed, and that is going directly to whom we consider experts of their own experiences, and those are current college students, and asking them their experiences from an academic perspective, campus culture, financial aid, career services. What is your life like at the school that you're attending? Not just academic experience, although obviously incredibly important, but what is your life outside the classroom like? And as you noted, from a career services perspective, from a mental health services on campus, we all know incredibly important. And then our students and their parents, feeling that they are getting exceptional experiential learning opportunities or internships or co-ops or learning experiences. And will that loft them into careers of substance upon graduation, or great graduate schools and then careers of substance upon that? So that just is, it all goes down to asking students. And we had, nearly 170,000 students for this edition of the book give their opinions as to what their experiences are. And then we take that and we craft 2-page narratives in the book. We put it on princetonreview.com as well, so you could look up any of this stuff. And then all of the ranking lists that we have are 100% driven by students. There are 50 of them in the book, ranked 1 to 25. And these are things that the way we think about it from an editorial perspective is what would a college-bound student want to know about a school that they're considering putting on their list to attend? And that's really the value of this book and ultimately its ranking list. I'm going to pull out my copy. It's right here on the side.
Yeah. Go for it. And Rob, if you can let our listeners know, because I feel like people are blitzed and bombarded with everybody labeling something a ranking, right? You've got the QS rankings, US News, Niche, Wall Street, Times Herald, Forbes, just goes on, Washington Post, just goes on and on and on, the glut of rankings, and there's new ones popping up all the time. Can you explain to our listeners, like how many of those other ones are surveying 170,000 people or even 5,000 people? Talk about how those other rankings are completely different from what you do.
Yeah. Oh, I so appreciate the question here. But the truth is that to answer your question, none of them are serving the number of current college students that we are. And
Yeah.
I believe that is one of the great values of what we've been doing over time. And I say this, and I retell stories often from the past, but there was an op-ed from USA Today, and they were asking this question a couple years back, and they noted in that, and again, this was not based on any editorial that we had. But they said, listen, Princeton Review is doing a public service because it is asking students. This isn't my opinion. Mark, I like the idea that we're giving students voice, but I wouldn't be able to write that narrative myself because I'm not a sophomore at Vassar or, a junior at UCLA. But those students can tell us their experiences, and thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands more can give us those experiences as well. And then try to glean from that, what are students saying in that great middle, rather than an outlier at either end of the spectrum. What is a representative voice at an Occidental college? What does that mean? And I feel like having great breadth of survey data and then depth of survey data is, allows us to be able to do that at the Princeton Review consistently annually.
And talk about why you will not see in this book, this is the 7th best college overall, or this is the, 29th best national university. Talk about why you don't do that.
I find it of so little value for a college-bound student to say, this school is ranked, 720th nationally, of schools in the, for biology programs. It doesn't make a lot of sense. You and I have both been working with college-bound students for a long time. They just don't yet have that vernacular, or the majority of them don't. They do respond to what students are saying about their experiences. They do respond about when asking about what they love at their high school experience, and then turning that into a conversation for college. But I don't like hierarchical ranking lists in general, 1 to 1,001 best Northeastern schools or whatever it might be. Because again, I don't think it is of great value to the ultimate user, who is a student and their parents.
Yeah, and one reason why it's not of great value is what one person looks for is completely different than what somebody else looks for, right? If I'm going to die in a city or in a cold weather place or in a small place or in a place with no sports or it's not strong in my major, like how can you tell me what the overall ranking is? Like I need to decide that for myself. And so I appreciate the fact that you'll rank schools in categories based on survey data, but you're not turning around to anybody and saying this school is 67th and this school is 367th, right?
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
really important that, and I think, and I know you guys would never do that because I've heard you speak on this. Like that's just something that, you're adamantly opposed to. And I really respect that highly.
I appreciate that, Mark. I really do. And I think, you and I think about this so similarly, this idea of allowing a student to find a fit in a true best fit. Now, that doesn't mean that best fit has to happen at just one school. It can happen at 5. It can happen at 10. Because the truth is that, there are 3,000 plus 4-year colleges in the U.S. alone, but the likelihood that you can be given the resources and the ability to dig down to have the conversation of substance with us, with your parents, with your counselors, with your friends, to figure out if that school is going to be a best fit for you on any number of variables. But that to me is of such great value rather than just brand or the perception that we place in that brand. And although those are valuable because we're human, that shouldn't be where our factoring stops. And that feels responsible to me.
Rob, let's talk about the surveys. I've seen you say this year you're up to 430 average per campus, but that's a range, right? So what would be kind of the low and the high in that range of how many surveys you're doing per campus?
Yeah, it depends on the size of the school, right? Because at UMass Amherst, I was up there not too long ago. I mean, there's 22,000 students in the school. almost 13,000 students from UMass. So for great big schools, we have great, numbers of surveys. But, I went to a little school in New Jersey called Drew University, as I said in the opening, 1,800 students. And, we'll get probably 200 from Drew, maybe 225, somewhere in there. So it does vary depending on the size of the school. And I don't want that to be me trying to cop out on the answer.
No. I appreciate that. That's good. I'm more interested in how you do the surveys. I think our listeners would be as well. Talk about how you do it. Like, where do you find the kids, and what questions do you ask, and what's kind of the methodology there?
Yeah. This is almost a year-long process. So the book came out right after the Olympics this year, end of August. It'll come out a little earlier this year because there's no Olympics this summer. But we will start the survey process at the beginning of October, and we send out, I have a little survey team here at Princeton Review here in New York, and then we'll send out requests to any number of folks. Usually we work with the dean and director of admission. Sometimes it's the president or the chancellor. Sometimes it's an institutional research office. But generally speaking, it's a mixture of all of those different teams. And we will ask them to, hey, we're the Princeton Review. This is what we do. We have a student survey. You're familiar with it. Here's what we wrote about you guys last year based on your student survey. Here are the ranking lists that you appeared on. Here's our methodology. But inherent to that methodology is allowing us to send out messaging to your students to encourage them to fill out our survey. Now, from there, some schools will, say, hey, we're so grateful and we want you to, we'll send out your message. We'll send it through an email campaign. We'll do social postings. We'll do any number of things. But that's where we rely on the schools to say, what is the best way to get at that student population? Now, unlike some other competitors, they might ask the dean or director of admission to curate 10 or 15 students and then let those students be the ones that are surveyed. And although that might be of value, to me, we've wanted from an editorial and a data integrity perspective to cast a wide net, to pull in a great deal of survey information so that it is not curated by any one particular group, even though that group might be well-intentioned. But still, we want the voices of many rather than the voices of few, because we want to get that representative voice, a representative essence of what that school is for typical students. And because we've been doing this for a long time, Mark, and I don't rest on the laurels of history, but the truth is that many folks have seen our Princeton Review rankings, have used them, have found value in them, and hence they are agreeable to sending out our survey. And that's it. So generally speaking, well, it takes from October until, let's call it, early March. And then we'll close off our surveys, and then we start to write the narratives that are inherent to each of the profiles, the 2-page profiles of each of the schools, and then we start to crunch the data from a rankings perspective as well. So that's kind of just the nuts and bolts of it.
Friends, this concludes part 1 of my interview with Rob Franek, the editor-in-chief of the Princeton Review. We hope you join us next week for part 2 of 3. Friends, on the Big Enchilada, episode 500, Julie and I will have a very important discussion about the danger of having a top-heavy list. We will then have a brand new interview with Christoph Gutentag, Dean of Admissions at Duke University. You will hear from Christoph for 5 consecutive Mondays, but it's actually 2 separate interviews that we're going to do. The first interview is going to be a 2-parter, and it's going to be all about understanding Duke University. And the last 3 parts are all about understanding how Duke University makes undergraduate admissions decisions. Friends, remember to block out the noise. Run your own race, because college is a match to be made and not a prize to be won. See you on the Big Enchilada, episode 500 on Monday. Have a good weekend, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.